All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first readings from AML Awards finalists in the novel and short story. This is one of the sessions of the online 2021 Association for Mormon Letters Conference. You can follow other events on our YouTube channel. I'll insert a link in the chat to the complete conference program. Andrew Hall is our awards coordinator, and he'll be the MC for the readings tonight. So Andrew, I'll hand the time over to you. Welcome to our first readings.
Thank you, Jane.
From AML Awards finalists.
We're hearing Michael. Sounds like his
this is
doubling up. There we go. Thank you. So I'm Andrew Hall, and I'm very happy to have a wonderful group of authors joining us here today. We have, and I'm going to share my screen. We have 3 categories of AML awards that we're going to be hearing from the finalists today. And from the novelist finalists, we have Charity Shumway and Phyllis Barbour, Twyla Newey, Mahonai Stewart, and Rick Grunder. Then from the short fiction finalists, we have Ryan Habermeyer, Megan Mk Hutchins, William Morris. Ryan Shoemaker is going to present a different night. He couldn't be with us tonight. And Maureen Whipple has passed away. If we have enough time, I'll read her story. And also short fiction collection finalists, only 2 this year. Eric James Stones is with us. Eric James Stone, and also Maureen Whipple has one there. Okay, so let's turn over to Charity first. I'll do a very brief introduction of everybody. Charity Shumway is the author of the novel 10 Girls to Watch from 2012. She earned an MFA in creative writing from Oregon State University. She and her family now live in New York, and she'll be presenting, doing a reading from her novel, Bountiful.
Unmute myself, thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. Just a little setup about what this is. There are 2 main characters in the novel, a mother, Nedra, and her daughter, her adult daughter, Heather. And the book starts out with them having a sort of a Christmas holiday spat where Heather calls her mother a bigot, and Nedra doesn't really love that. So this is a chapter later when she's reflecting on that conversation. And I'll do a few jumps, but I'll fill you in on what I'm skipping. What really got to Nedra in all this was the presumption that she was a fool, brainwashed by the patriarchy. Absolutely not. How was it possible that Heather could fail to see that she was self-determined, a woman who had made her own choices and held her own convictions? The way Nedra saw it, she was halfway to a rebel. Her first clear choice, Doug. All those years ago, when Nedra met Douglas Walker, future husband and father of 5 little Walkers, she was exactly the sort of working woman Heather seemed to think she had no ability to understand. And then Nedra sort of reflects on meeting and marrying Doug and choosing to move her family to Bountiful, the town she grew up in, and then choosing the house that they lived in. And I'll pick up again here. She said, the house had been on the market for long enough that the price had dropped into their range, or close to their range. To help make up the difference, Nedra went back to teaching piano in the afternoons while her mother watched the kids. She'd been teaching piano ever since. But over the years, Doug had advanced at work. The money she earned became less important. And then President Benson gave his famous talk to mothers in Zion. His words had a godly bite. Fathers are to provide, to love, to teach, and to direct. Mothers are to conceive, to nourish, to love, and to train. Come home, wives, to your husbands. Come home, wives, to your children. The Lord's way is not the world's way. A mother's calling is in the home, not in the marketplace. A child needs a mother more than all the things money can buy. Magnify the noblest calling of all, a mother in Zion. Nedra was hardly flouting President Benson's holy utterances at the time. She wholeheartedly agreed with them. Mother of 4 with a 5th on the way, she believed raising children was a sacred calling, the highest and best use she could possibly think of for her time. It could be exhausting and occasionally thankless, and her heart burned with gratitude for President Benson's recognition of her value. And yet, even as Nedra embraced the prophet's words, she felt the tiny barb of chastisement inside them, those 2.5 hours of piano teaching Monday through Thursday. It wasn't as if she was abandoning her children to pursue godless mammon. It was piano lessons, music, a community service, raise a song of praise to the Lord, etc. A mere 2.5 hours a day. And yet, after President Benson's talk, she and Doug discussed her teaching in strained, quiet voices. He could provide everything they needed. What reason was there for her to go on working? She might have given in. She certainly felt guilty. She prayed and pondered it. She played out the phone calls she would make to her students' parents, informing them of the change. And yet there was an undeniable fact. She liked teaching. She liked the music. She liked the students. And something more inexplicable and more compelling than those easy explanations. She liked the way teaching piano lessons transformed her. As soon as she took up her chair next to the piano bench, it was almost as if she'd never left. One lesson connected to the next on a timeless satiny ribbon. Whatever happened outside the piano room, squabbling children, dirty laundry, turned to air, not forever, but for a moment. She could have been teaching a lesson for 2 minutes or 2 hours, and yet the feeling was the same. Eyes on the keys and fingers, ears alert, green pencil poised to mark the page. It's not the same as really working. I teach lessons at home, she'd said to Doug and to herself. It's good for the kids to spend time with their grandparents. When it became clear she wasn't changing her mind, Doug finally stopped pushing, and Nedra had searched her own heart and found her compliance with the word of the Lord to be perfectly adequate. The issue had come up again here and there over the years whenever Doug encountered a new stress at work or in his church calling, whenever they were especially worried about one of the kids. But Nedra had remained firm. Not that choosing to be a piano teacher was some marker of wild liberality. She knew Heather would roll her eyes if she tried to claim that one. But it signified something. Nedra was a person with experience finding her own way. She wasn't a person who had never struggled or questioned or thought her own thoughts. She'd made her own choices, and the fact that Heather couldn't see this, that Heather seemed to think she needed to open her mother's sheltered little brain to the big wide world, it brought out all of Nedra's slapping impulses. That's it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next, we'll have Ryan Habermeyer reading from his story, Every Nerve Singing. Ryan's debut collection of short fictions, called The Science of Lost Futures, was published in 2018 and won the AML Short Fiction Collection Award that year. He received his PhD from the University of Missouri and currently teaches creative writing at Salisbury University. Ryan, go ahead.
Thank you, Andrew. You can hear me, right? I'm just double checking because I don't think I checked them before. Okay, good. Just a little background to this. I wrote this a couple of years ago. It's a story about a woman who believes she's transforming into a jellyfish. And I don't really know how I came to that course other than to say John Benyon was on here earlier. And I was one of John's students many years ago at BYU. And John told me in the classroom that my real talent was weirdness and that I should run with that. And I've been doing that ever since. So thank you, John. And here I am. So I'll just read about the first page of this. It's called Every Nerve Singing. Nobody believes me when I tell them how I became a jellyfish. It's no mystery. It happened years ago, maybe centuries. I don't remember. Time is measured different for jellies. We are invertebrates. You'd be surprised how senseless a spine can make you. There was a traveling science exhibit. Twice a year, they rented a gray brick building on the north side of town. Once they displayed a unicorn tusk. Another year, they promised a mermaid, but really it was a large fishtail sewn together with a monkey suspended in formaldehyde. But I saw it 11 times. The year I discovered the jellyfish, the rumors were they would exhibit Albert Einstein's brain. The picture on the flyer looked like pasta. I was the first in line. The paper wasp nests were sad and the 1,000-year-old eggs seemed fake. My father's bookkeeper followed me room to room, whispering inane things until I lost him in the room with the floating light bulb. The Chinese acupuncture needles were boring and the pickled homunculus in the jar looked asleep. I didn't expect to enjoy the jellyfish, but found myself watching them for hours. The next morning I returned. The jellyfish exhibit was in the small room on the 4th floor. A black curtain hung in the doorway. Medusosa, the plaque said. The only light behind the curtain came from the pinks and blues and lavenders radiating from the jellyfish bodies floating inside an enormous aquarium tank. I lost count of them dozens of times. Some were like discs of alien moons, while others fanned their tentacles in great swaths of golden hair like decapitated Rapunzels. They pulsed from one end of the tank to the other, lost in their aimlessness. I tapped the glass, but they ignored me. One was shaped like a church bell. It pulsed gently, a long bridal veil of tentacles in its wake. As it passed in its loop, I thought I heard music. In the hallway, I leaned against the doorway. It hurt to breathe, like all the air had been sucked out of the sky. Such a waste, yes, a voice behind me said. It was my father's friend, the bookkeeper. He was thin and boyish, with hair that looked as if his mother had combed it. We walked around the fountain. The bookkeeper talked about Einstein's brain and assured me on the scale of marvelous things, it was a 0. He was fond of zeros. 0 is the happiest of all numbers, he told me. At the end of the day, if a man can go home to a fat wife and fall asleep with a full stomach and zeros in his ledger, well, that is a happy man, the bookkeeper smiled. We slept together. Don't be surprised. After being in the presence of a jellyfish, I needed to wrap myself around spine and ribs and feel the grating of my body against something warm and useless like a man. In the morning, unable to think of anything else all night, I crept out of the room and bought a ticket to see the jellyfish again. Nobody else came to see the jellies, distracted by lesser wonders, but I watched them, paralyzed and unblinking. One by one, they circled the tank, these luminescent gorgons. They took no notice of me, and yet I knew they were aware of me. Their only imperative was to float. Spinelessness had set them free. I was mesmerized by their translucent tentacles, oblivious to the world, yet stretched blindly as if hoping to be embraced. Despite their blindness, their tentacles only rarely tangled as they circled in their ballet, and when they did twist together, it was a kiss of sorts, their gelatinous bodies never twisting in awkward revulsion from one another the way people do on a crowded street. They always knew the distance between themselves and the bending of space. The more I watched, the more I attuned to their secret desire to exist outside of time, that is, to live sideways, which is why we jellies are seldom vertical or horizontal, but always floating at an angle. And I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much. We don't have applause here on the Zoom, but we're all applauding. Next, so I'm going novels and short stories, every other one. So that was a short story. Next, we'll hear from Rick Grunder. Am I pronouncing that right, Rick?
Grunder. Grunder, yeah.
Rick Grunder, who'll be reading from his Biblio Mystery 116. Rick has been an antiquarian bookseller for 40 years. Set deep in the woods of central New York, the Rick Grunder Books, is located an hour's drive from Palmyra. He is the author of a 5-volume historical reference work, Mormon Parallels, a bibliographic source, and co-author with Will Bagley of I Could Hardly Hold the Pen, Phoebe Ann Woolley Davis's Hard Road to Utah and Back. 116 is his first published novel. Go ahead, Rick.
So thanks so much. I think my selection will be one of the darkest ones tonight. So all I can tell you in my defense is these are 2 of the villains in the book. So, don't worry how nasty they get sometimes. They negotiated their way through dry sagebrush outside the high stone enclosure behind Layton's house. When they reached the back, the prophet unlocked a heavy gate in the thick wall through which they stepped suddenly into virtual Eden. The assistant stopped. "This is amazing. I wouldn't have guessed you had such a green backyard." "The garden of the Lamb. It belongs to all of us jointly, as does everything in the order." Brian didn't notice anyone else enjoying the Lamb's garden just now. Maybe common ownership wasn't so common even here. Such stunning verdure is expensive luxury in the desert. The lawn was thick as a golf green. There had to be a dozen varieties of trees within these couple acres of manicured space. It would look stupendous soon when the leaves turned. An area was glassed in along the back wall of the house with elaborate lattice work that screened a sort of conservatory. Was that a hot tub in the corner? The prophet should use it more often. I've known Harry for many years and sold him a number of books and papers that we no longer need in our archives. Need is a relative term, but everyone needs money, and Brian's head began to spin. "May I see your library? Have a seat out here, and I'll bring something to show you." Blakeman apparently didn't want Harry's assistant inside the house without preparation. The table was of wrought iron, topped in some kind of polished stone inlay with a few pieces of turquoise. It was a little tacky, but costly looking for outdoor furniture. A self-conscious fountain gurgled watchfully against the inner wall. The prophet was back in a minute with a fair-sized 19th century box made of tin, lacquered in black with gilt trim. You've heard of John D. Lee. The assistant had heard of Lee and the horrific massacre of September 11, 1857, when Mormons slaughtered an entire wagon train of unlucky immigrants trying to cross southern Utah. Blakeman lifted the lid to reveal an assortment of papers, apparently all handwritten. They were of various sizes and textures, even different colors. Some were soiled and worn. Others were gathered into neat piles and tied carefully with old-looking ribbon or string. Some of those bundles surely had not been opened in 100 years. May I? Be my guest. Look to your heart's content, young Mormon, and tell Harry to buy this junk from me and send lots of cash. Brian lowered his head to glance across the surface of the table to make sure it was perfectly dry before he emptied the old container. As he dug down, he came upon 3 small travel diaries bound in sheepskin, dyed and textured to look like fine Morocco leather. They were attractive still and surprisingly fresh, as if no one cared to read them. One had an old stationer's label inside from Fayetteville, Arkansas. Brian flipped to the end, but he had to backtrack because the leaves were blank after September 10. He looked at the other things in the box, certain papers he couldn't identify right away, and the words struck him as strange or likely vulnerable. The language in other places sounded unaccountably hard. Crassly matter of fact, Brian could only skim random passages for now, but some of them caught his breath. He knew to act his part carefully and not betray his fascination. Of course, Hyde's firm must acquire this material, sometime when the 116 pages were not the sole urgent object of his inquiry. Accompanying the diaries were 8 or 10 cased images, daguerreotypes and ambrotype photographs of families and individuals. One little girl wore a grave, solemn expression because she was trying to sit very still, like the photographer asked. He had rewarded her efforts by tinting her cheeks a soft, rosy hue, tipping the buttons of her fine Sunday dress with gold that still gleamed. The velvet lining of the case remained perfectly dark and new, as if no one had dared to look at this child again. Beneath it all were a dozen large sheets of paper that barely fit the box. Their edges had curled across the years. They bore accounts of cattle and rifles, clothing, jewelry, and sundry household goods. A column on the right assessed values. The total given at the bottom of the last page was staggering by 1857 standards. Along the margin beside each entry, another person had written names that Brian recognized as early Mormon families in the territory. But for much of this plunder, no recipient was named. Instead, a simple notation appeared over and over throughout the listings: BSH, Bishop's Storehouse. Brian reached a final piece of paper, and it was a coarse-looking thing directly against the bottom of the metal box. Crackling paint had left the letter discolored and brittle. It was addressed to Lieutenant General Daniel H. Wells, Great Salt Lake City, yet here it remained, far from its destination. The contents were barely readable, but the assistant read carefully. His knowledge was weak in this area, and he didn't always understand 19th century expressions, but what he saw sobered him here as much as anything else. The writer didn't sign his name, but he sounded defensive, even threatening in places. And at the end, this final paragraph: "My life is as dear to me, Brother Daniel, as yours is to you. See that the burden is not cast my way, or I shall put the saddle on the right horse. And them that are in high places shall be rode to hell, and you know I can do it. We have the evidence, secure, like the nail in a sure place, which you will never find, so help me God." The assistant looked at Blakeman, whose face betrayed nothing. He understood that whatever had been done to that writer was right. It was well to follow first principles when they could be followed, loving God first and then your fellow beings. It was nice to understand theology when there was time for it. Good to pay tithing if there was money. But what the gospel required absolutely was just one thing: unquestioning obedience to the dictates of the Lord, passed from his chosen prophet, down the chain of priesthood command to the humblest elder wherever you lived. If every point and precept of Mormonism were to fail utterly, one immutable law would still be remembered and ever hold sway: do as we say. Obey, obey. Those were rough times. The people here were under considerable pressure, isolated as we were. The prophet said it easily, speaking from a dry and forbidding land. There was no apologizing. He wasn't defending. It had taken a while for Brion to fathom what lay here, and it would take a minute to compose himself, while Blakeman acted bored, almost.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much. William Morris is going to read from his short story, Certain Places, which was published in Dialogue. William is the author of the story collection Dark Watch and Other Mormon American Stories, which was an AML Award finalist. He received an AML Criticism Award in 2005 for his literature blog on Motley Vision. He co-edited or edited the anthologies Monsters and Mormons and States of Deseret. And his alternative history story, The Darkest Abyss in America, received first place in a Dialogue annual award. William, go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew. So the story begins with a middle-aged man in the Sacramento temple packing his temple clothes. We experience his thoughts, especially his anxieties, but then when he leaves the temple, he changes. He becomes a middle-aged woman. The mechanism of this is not defined, and he is still conscious of himself as himself, but she is also conscious of him and he of her, and they're not just him and her, but are in some sense each other. And so this is what happens next. They arrive at the car. It is her car, not his car. It is an all-wheel drive station wagon. It is dark green. There's a rainbow sticker in the back window. He thinks that it being so true to form is a clue that this she who is so different from he is maybe not all that different. She thinks nothing of it. It's just a car she drives. She drops the duffel bag on the seat next to her. She zips it open and looks into it. He expects to see a bundle of temple clothing. There is no bundle of temple clothing. He is confused. What she sees confuses her too. She sees a pile of folded fabric, a quilt. It is white and green. The fabric is satin. It seems like something that would be part of her life, but she doesn't quite know why. She doesn't take it out of the duffel bag, which she is quite sure is her duffel bag, the one she takes to the Y. But she lifts a layer of it and fills the fabric. It's not a complete quilt. It is a quilt top. It seems like it's for a baby blanket, but she doesn't quilt. She believes that her wife quilts, but she isn't sure about that now because he is so sure that his wife quilts. The freeways and roads home are familiar to him in their bland suburban generalities and unfamiliar in their particularities. Every turn feels right. Every turn feels slightly off. She pulls into the driveway of a house that is smaller and in a neighborhood that is slightly shabbier and homier than the one he lived in. She pauses, looks at the flower beds full of sage, lavender, fuchsia, deer grass, goldenrod, and river rock, looks at the verdigreed hummingbird wind chime. It all seems right. She clicks the garage door opener. The door opens. She pulls in and finds everything quite familiar. She is more nervous than he to find her wife. She is afraid that she will somehow be changed. But he is more nervous than her. When they finally find her out in the backyard tending to the tomatoes, summer squashes, and melons, because it is her. That is, it is his wife too, or rather a version of her. Early on, she attempts to keep his wife separate from her wife, but it's challenging. She keeps opening doors for her, keeps buying the wrong kind of ice cream, keeps getting in on the wrong side of the bed. Her wife is remarkably indulgent about these missteps, makes a comment about extra stress at work. She wonders if agreeing with that diagnosis is a betrayal, wonders if she should explain that he is now part of her, but he agrees that she shouldn't. She isn't sure she should let him be her conscience in this matter, but she loves her wife dearly and deeply, and so does he. And so practically, there is no real difference between before and now when it comes to their marriage. This makes it easier for both of them to settle into her life. Yes, it is strange, but the very fact that they are each other makes it impossible for either of them to radically change how they live. Everything develops an odd pattern of unreality if he or she thinks about things too much. But mostly, they don't think about things too much. Thanks.
Thank you, William. Phyllis Barbour is the author of The Desert Between Us, which was published by the University of Nevada Press. Phyllis has been writing award-winning stories, articles, essays, and books for over 35 years, including the short story collections The School of Love and Parting the Veil, Stories from a Morbid Imagination, the novel And the Desert Shall Blossom, and 3 memoirs, starting with How I Got Cultured, a Nevada memoir, which won the 1992 AML Award for memoir, I'm not sure. She was presented with the Smith Pettit Foundation Award for Outstanding Contribution to Mormon Letters in 2016. Phyllis, go ahead.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me? Am I coming on? I don't see myself. Oh, well, I'll just go ahead.
You're fine.
You can hear me all right. Between Us is a historical novel set in 1858 to 1870 and begins after a military expedition has been conducted to find a middle route to California. 75 camels have been bought in the Middle East by the US government in the belief that these animals can handle the waterless terrain better than domestic horses and mules. The novel begins when Jeffrey Scott, a road builder on the expedition, goes north with one of the camels which have been abandoned by the military and a Mojave companion. There he meets Sophia, the third wife of the polygamous Charles, and eventually falls in love. The scene I'll be reading occurs after Charles's horse, Midnight, has panicked and run wild after being frightened by the camel. Charles is returning home after capturing and calming his horse. And there she is, he calls out when he and Midnight are almost home. "Oh, Bee, Sophia Hughes," a basket on her hip. Her youthfulness pulls his whiskers. He feels himself turning to undifferentiated liquid around her. She isn't fully formed, he reminds himself, too accustomed to finery in England, to the gracious things people have above her station did. She even dreams fancy, silken hats, gentlemen with brass-headed canes and pocket watches. That's plain vanity, malarkey even, but still. After Charles fences Midnight in the corral, he notices Sophia's holding the clothespins in her hand, the one he carved for her on a whim one night, that bearded husband. It's one of the clothespin figurines he'd whittled, happy with a knife in hand. And here she stands, holding the clothespin firmly, her fingers wrapped around it, caressing it. As much as he'd rather not, he also notices the stranger and the camel at the back. What are they doing in my yard anyway? But he smiles, a brief pause from his overbearing self, which is a burden at times, he admits. Something about clothespins and camels causes a slight gentling in his mood, the one that's been growing worse all morning. He removes his hat with a gallant sweep of his arms. "Afternoon, ma'am," he says, swishing his hat playfully, bowing to her, noticing her wide face and high cheekbones beneath the part in the middle of her hair, the impeccably straight line from crown to forehead. She raises her face to him and he bends to receive a welcome home kiss. "Glad you're home, Charles," she whispers in his ear. "Much has been happening in your absence." "You could say that," he says. He surveys his property, his castle keep, that's what it is, and sees something he'd like to root out. "By the way," he says, ignoring the camel and stranger for a minute, "I better tell you I saw Brother Gil and Elmira on my way home, pulling out." Her face changes. Her mouth curves toward the dusty ground, a pout even. "Tell me it isn't true, please. Elmira is my friend, and she didn't even say goodbye." "Big hurry, couldn't get out of here fast enough." "She should have said goodbye, Charles," Sophia says, more hurt on her face. "She was my best friend." "Don't get all worked up about it. People are going crazy, losing their minds. That's what's happening, but she'll miss you, you know that." "But she was..." She purses her lips and Charles watches her swallowing. If Charles looked and listened more closely, he would see that her face is saying that her friend is her only tie to sanity, let alone levity. He would see a devastation, something Sophia can't put into words. But he chooses to inhale a larger than usual breath of air that pinches his nose in the overwhelming heat. He's got to take charge of this mess, all made worse by the wind, this blasted sun. Will you be all right, Charles? Sophia asks, stepping back, not allowing any more of her feelings to show. I know this must be upsetting, another family moving out, and then Midnight's panic. What he wants to say and doesn't is, what in tarnation is going on here? What's a camel doing in the Mojave Desert in our yard? Who do you think you are to be talking to some stranger as if you knew him, making trouble, making tongues wag? But his temper, yes, that. She says it frightens her and makes her tremble where he can't see. She says she feels like a young child in line to be lashed. Sophia, he calls out in a voice he measures with as much judiciousness as he can muster. Sophia slips her hands inside the pockets of her apron. Charles sees a fist against the fabric. She must be holding the clothespin. Quite a surprise to see him spook like that, she continues, just like it was quite a surprise for me when that camel and stranger showed up. Keeping one hand balled, she pulls the other one out of its pocket and touches his arm to reassure him. She's the good wife once again, he hopes. No sign of upset left.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Okay, it actually came through?
Yes, we got it. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
I forgot to mention also William's story. Certain places, there's also a recording available on the Dialogue podcast. If anybody looks at the Dialogue podcast stream, there's several of their stories they've done dramatic recordings of called Dialogue Out Loud. So look, and they did a great job with that. So look for that. Next we have, I'm going to scroll down here. Megan Mk Hutchins, who will read from her short story Upcycling Death. Megan has written two YA fantasy novels, Drift and The Redwood Palace. Her short fiction appears in Orson Scott Card's Intergalactic Medicine Show, Daily Science Fiction, and elsewhere. She studied archaeology at BYU, and she currently lives in Utah. Megan, go ahead.
Hi. I wrote this story in 2019 after watching a lot of really cool sewing videos on YouTube, and I'm just going to start at the beginning. Death looked into Marjorie's shop through the window. She was holding a blue and white plaid men's shirt, extra large, her favorite size. He leaned closer to the glass as Marjorie killed the poor thing, first taking off the sleeves with those wicked bright scissors. Snitch, snitch, snitch. She sliced what was left across the middle. From the top half, she fashioned a little square neck bodice, turning it around so it buttoned up the back. She made a gathered skirt of the bottom remnant with a bit more cutting and stitching. Puff sleeves finished off the dress. Before she killed it, the shirt had been a drab thing for a man to wear to an office. Now it looked like it belonged in the Wizard of Oz. Death sighed. Marjorie seemed so like himself. She'd killed the shirt and made something else, like autumn leaves becoming compost, becoming flowers, like a tree becoming firewood, becoming warmth and light, like a human life decomposing complexity into a story for the following, as useful after winter in case of a bad storm. Those stories taught you something, made lives better, longer. Marjorie's death wouldn't warn anyone about not catching cancer. She couldn't have done anything to avoid it. No, the entire category of cautionary deaths from number 142 to number 338 didn't suit Marjorie. He usually knew just what kind of death best fit a person, just like Marjorie instinctively knew where to cut. The bell on the front of the shop jangled. Death jumped. Marjorie. She was staring straight at him with those salt and pepper curls softly framing. Her smile was as warm as flannel. You're welcome to come in and look, even if you can't buy. She stuck out a hand. I'm Marjorie. He wasn't invisible, but people never really noticed him unless he'd been staring at them for too long, and he tried not to stare. Death hadn't actually talked to a human since the Alamo. His throat dry, and swallowing didn't help much. I'm Jim. It was the name of the last person he'd Scene sent off. 81-year-old male, alone in a retirement home. Death type number 441, a forgotten elder. No one would remember his story except as a number about how human connections affected life expectancy. It seemed a wasteful way to recycle a whole life, but it was something the next generation could perhaps use to find happier lives for themselves. Well, come on in. It's cold outside, Marjorie said. What could he do but follow? Her shop smelled like cotton and thread, with a hint of warm machine oil lingering behind it. Marjorie took her cheerful blue dress, folded it, and put it in a box. You're not putting the dress on display? No, I've got plenty of stock and not enough customers. That'll be donated to kids entering the foster system. Every girl ought to have something fun to wear. Oh, I've got others like it, she said, moving toward a rat gingham calico seersucker, dresses for summer, dresses for fall. All of them with pockets. Girls need a place to collect rocks and ribbons and leaves. She didn't sound the least bit guilty about killing extra large men's shirts to make dresses for little girls. Does anyone ever get upset at you for cutting things up? She laughed. Clean old clothes? Not at all. Perhaps that was the difference between them. No one wanted the old clothes anymore, so whatever she made was a gift. Dying people, though, usually wanted to stay. Marjorie's time was almost up. He could feel it creeping his arms like frost hardening on a window, 2 days before it burst out of his hands. He could stage her death a little sooner, shape its meaning. Maybe a number 18 died suddenly while working. She could be a reminder that time was precious. Uncounted people before her, back to the dawn of humanity, had been a number 18. Their collective story had inspired poets, from the writers of Ecclesiastes to Nezahualcóyotl to modern pop singers. Becoming the meat of artists was not such a bad thing. But when Death glanced at the little gingham dress in the box, it didn't feel right, like trying to sew on a zipper with a zigzag stitch. Marjorie wasn't a number 18. He didn't know what she ought to be. I have to go, he fumbled. She sweetly waved goodbye. Come back again soon. No one asked Death to come back. She didn't mean it. No idea that after their conversation, he spent the afternoon shaping tens of thousands of deaths. But he had to go back, or her ending would burst out, random and haphazard, like knotted together fabric scraps, meaningless. Marjorie wouldn't get a chance to become something grand after her end, which he could not say about the burgundy corduroy pants she'd killed. She was transforming the hideous things into a cute as a button pair of overalls for some little cruel people, into great stories. Just the right timing and setting. Marjorie was like a couture ball gown, though. However she died, he couldn't improve upon what she already was. Long before she knew about the cancer, she sewed clothes for kids who needed to be wrapped in fabrics that said that they were safe, that someone would take care of them. Would Marjorie hate him afterwards when she saw her own body gray and limp and lifeless? He didn't want to watch her hate him. He felt she was the one person who might understand what he did. He couldn't change the time of death more than a day or two, but he could stage deaths for a little more meaning, just like she gave a little more meaning and use to those clothes before they inevitably wore out. I will stop there.
Thank you, Megan.
Thanks.
For me, the audio kind of came in and out a little bit. Hopefully it was just on my side.
Oh, my internet connection is not great, so it might be me.
well, if certainly find the story, everybody, if you didn't hear it all. Okay, next we're going to have from Twyla Newey, who will be reading from her novel Sylvia, published by BCC Press. Twyla earned a BA in English from BYU and an MFA in Writing and Poetics from the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at Naropa University. What a great school name. She was a finalist for the 2019 Coniston Prize at Radar Poetry. Sylvia is her first published novel. Twyla, go ahead.
Hi, thank you all for having me. It's been a pleasure to listen to all the other readers tonight. I'm just going to begin at the beginning. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Eve. Her hands were in the soil, her fingers digging around the roots of small weeds. She'd woken early from the dream, the warmth of the small fingers fading from her hand and walked out into the backyard. The smell of citrus hung in the air, and she thought of early fall mornings in her mother's garden. Her mom's hair held back by a blue bandana, turning, smiling, standing barefoot in the cool, wet grass. The image hung in the dawn light between sight and memory. As her mind struggled through the thick heat of the Indian summer morning. The air felt wrong. By late September, mornings should have already begun to turn cool, the air thin and crisp, an intake of breath sufficient to clear out the mists of sleep. Instead, it was still heavy with summer fever. The hinges squeaked as the screen door opened. She brushed her dark hair out of her eye with the back of her hand and turned to see who was stepping out with the sunrise. Just Mo, she thought, talking to someone on the phone. His form was shadow, the rising sun a flash behind him in her eyes. The low murmur of his voice mixed with the buzz of bees at their everyday work. Her eyes followed the small dark dots of their bodies as they visited one plant and then the next. She watched attentively as they burrowed into the tiny flowers. He touched her on the shoulder. She turned her head back toward him, shading her eyes. He was still a shadow, the sun spilling around his edges. It's Roxy, Evie, your mom. She reached out and took the phone from him without listening, waving him off. He didn't move. Morning, Rox. She heard an intake of breath, a shudder. Mom was in a car accident, Evie, this morning, driving home from California. The roar of her own blood pumping in her ears. She looked up at Mo again, the wisteria behind him, fading along the cedar trellis. He was crying, his hand rubbing his forehead. She heard the sound of a car start and pull out of a driveway, a siren somewhere far off. The glasses from last night's dinner sat on the table beneath the green shade umbrella. When he moved to sit beside her, she saw all the grief the sunrise had blocked. She tried to listen to her sister, locate her sister's reliable cheerfulness, but it had vanished. She spit words in Eve's ear. The memorial is this coming week, Friday. Yes, I booked you a flight. I sent an email with the link. You can print out your ticket. An email, Eve repeated. I sent it this morning early. We all left messages on your phone, Evie. I hadn't heard back from you. We'll stay at the cabin together. That way we can go through everything. Evie, she asked to be cremated. She wants us to scatter her ashes somewhere near Temp. No funeral. Mary's already been through her will. We've been up since early, 3 a.m. She already identified Mom's body. Silence. Eve, are you still there? I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Twyla. Next, we'll hear from Eric James Stone, who will be reading a story from his collection, The Humans in the Walls and Other Stories, which is Eric's second collection of short fiction. Over 50 of his short stories have appeared in venues such as Year's Best Science Fiction, Analog Science Fiction and Fact, and even the scientific journal Nature. His 2010 novelette, That Leviathan Whom Thou Hast Made, won the Nebula Award for Best Novelette and was a finalist for the Hugo Award, National Science Fiction Awards. And it's a wonderful Mormon science fiction story. His debut novel was the 2016 thriller Unforgettable. Eric, go ahead.
Okay, I'm actually going to read 2 of the 27 stories in my collection, but don't worry, they're really short.
Eric, did you get muted?
Okay, am I unmuted now?
I'm muted now, yep, you're good.
Motivational story. You start reading a story and realize it seems to be in second person, present tense, like one of those choose your own adventure stories. But it's not. This story is actually in epistolary format, a message from me to you. I've chosen this method of communication with you because it's unobtrusive and you can always dismiss it as being just a story. Who am I? Well, I'm an author, obviously. The more important question is, who are you? And the answer is, you are the protagonist of my current work in progress, a novel about, well, that would involve some spoilers. By now, you're having a hard time suspending disbelief. You think it's highly unlikely that you are living in a novel being written by somebody. You want proof. I don't blame you. I'd feel the same in your position. If I'm really your author, then I would know your backstory. I would know things about you that you've never let anybody else know about. And I could put one of those things in the next paragraph, addressing you specifically by name, and then you would know for certain that I am your author. But I'm not going to do that for two reasons. First, you're not the only person reading this story, and it would be rather embarrassing for you in your world if the other people reading this found out about certain things in your life. But more importantly, if you knew for certain that you were the protagonist in someone's novel, that would really change the way you acted. For example, you would know that you could not die, at least not until your life story had reached some sort of dramatic climax. And I don't want you engaging in unreasonably risky behavior that would lead you into situations I would then have to write you out of. So why send you this message at all? Well, you're not quite the character I anticipated when I started writing you. Don't get me wrong, you're a fine person with many admirable qualities. You also have flaws that humanize you. That's all good. I'm not criticizing you as a person. I'm criticizing you as the protagonist of my novel. And you have to admit, your life so far is not quite bestseller material. Now, you may think it's wrong of me to criticize you as a character for not living a bestseller life. That's a plotting issue, you might say. If my life isn't novel-worthy, it's because you haven't given my life a novel-worthy plot. Fair enough. I'll confess to not being an outliner. I'm more of a seat-of-my-pants type writer, so I don't exactly know where this novel is going, and I'll probably end up discarding the first couple of chapters, which I've written basically to get a feel for you as a character. Now that I do know what kind of person you are, I've run into a problem. In the very near future, you'll face a decision where one choice would take you so far out of your comfort zone that it seems a little unrealistic that you would take that route. But that's the choice you need to make in order to go on the adventure of your lifetime, or possibly several adventures if my agent can get the publisher to agree to a multi-book deal. That is why you're reading this story. So I can include a line about how you'd recently read a brilliant story. Okay, I'm laying it on a bit thick there. That had made you think about how you sometimes need to make choices that take you out of your comfort zone. It's your motivation for doing something that might otherwise be slightly out of character. Now that you've read this, I'm hoping you'll make the decision to choose your own adventure. Thanks and good luck. You're going to need it. The next story is Love is Orange, Love is Red. You don't say I love you anymore. Neither do I. We had only been dating 2 months the first time you told me you loved me. I love you too, I said. Of course, that was long before the empathy virus, so you hugged me tighter and believed. You love me with a waterfall of emotion, churning bright white in the sunlight as it roars down from a dizzying height, scattering rainbows everywhere. Maybe things would be different if you had come down with the virus first. I woke up feeling better after a good dose of NyQuil the night before, and I marveled as I lay in bed beside you, feeling for the first time the powerful emotions surging inside you. Odd that anyone could feel so much for me. I told you how wonderful that was. I love you with a deep blue river of emotion, slow and steady as it flows gently to the sea. The morning after you got sick, you woke up and looked into my heart, expecting to find a waterfall, the mirror image of what you felt for me. And it wasn't there. You don't say I love you because it hurts to hear a reply you can't believe. I don't say I love you because it hurts you when I do, and it hurts me to hurt you. On one of our early dates, we got to talking about colors. They're all in our heads, you said, just perception. But there's no way to know that the color red in your mind is the same as the color red in my mind. It might be what I see as orange or even green or blue. I shook my head. Red is red. Orange is orange. How can they be different for different people? I hope one day you'll understand I was wrong about colors.
Thank you, Eric. Mohan Stewart was the author of A New Age of Miracles. He's not here tonight. His novel, New Age of Miracles, is a historical fiction about Joseph Smith and his family during his early years in Palmyra. And so then the final story will be by Maureen Whipple. Maureen Whipple lived from 1903 to 1992. She was a Utah author best known for her novel, The Giant Joshua in 1941. She wrote this story, The Overcoat, in the 1940s, intending to include it in a volume of essays and stories about Utah designed for tourists, but which never came to pass, like a lot of Maureen's plans. It is from the recent collection, A Craving for Beauty, the collected writings of Maureen Whipple. So it's been published here for the first time, edited by Veda Hale, Lynn Larson, and myself. Also, the story was published in the AML literary journal Orientum in a special Halloween issue because it is a ghost story. So I think this was the only story by Maureen that was considered since, but it was published for the first time in Orientum, so it was considered. It's a fun kind of just ghost story, but if you want to read perhaps a little more serious and more Mormon themed story, there's a story called Mormon Saga that was published in Dialogue recently this year, so it wasn't considered for the awards for last year, about the saints in Nauvoo. This story, let me just briefly tell you what's going on. So it's about a University of Utah medical student who is very cold and unfeeling and uses people without caring about them at all. But he goes to a dance and he meets a mysterious girl and falls in love with her and becomes obsessed with her. And then, well, we'll see, she'll disappear and he becomes obsessed with what happened to her. And then there's ghostly things that we find out about her. So we're gonna start up from where they're at the dance. Then an unbelievable thing happened. She reached up and kissed him. A sense of golden lights exploded in his mind, a nebulous fragrance, an acute awareness of her body against his, warm and vibrant. And in the space of a heartbeat, she was gone. As if she had never been, he was alone again. All about him, only the dark and the cold and the snow. Uncontrollable paroxysms gripped his body. Not until the next day did he realize he had been shaking with chill. The girl had taken his overcoat with her. He had no idea how long he had stood there in the icy night. At last, some instinct deeper than awareness turned his steps around, drove his numbed feet home through the white, unearthly streets. By morning, his fog had lifted sufficiently for him to comprehend fleetingly that there was a fog. Now that he could see the whole thing in retrospect, the passionless finger of reason prodded at some obscure corner of his mind. He brushed it impatiently aside. Words on a page, test tubes in a laboratory. Nothing mattered but the magic of last night. It trembled along his nerves like something imagined, but never quite true. He pushed away the cold focus of reality. All that really existed for him that day lived in the filaments of memory, quivering at the back of his consciousness. Scalpel in hand, poised over his laboratory cadaver, he saw not the livid, anonymous face, but the girl's gardenia flesh. Not the dead body, but the girl's living slenderness in classic white, a being beyond dissection into cells and gristle and bone. In the obsessive extracortical area where he lived, no smell of formaldehyde penetrated. Instead, he seemed to move in some dim, drugged way to the airs of remembered springtime. It was not quite 4 o'clock when he stood once more before that mute door up on the avenues. Even in broad daylight, with the snow banked prosaically on each side of the walk and school kids shouting in the street below, there was something occult about that door. The trembling seized him again as he pressed the button. He waited for a tense eon. The door opened and the blood rushed to his face. And we'll stop there. So you'll have to tune in more to see what happens in the rest of the story. And certainly, she's a great Mormon author. If you get a chance, read The Giant Joshua, which is the great epic of Mormon pioneers and the story of the city of St. George. All right. Well, thank you everybody for participating. It was great to see you. And I'm so glad for the opportunity to share with the world what's going on amongst our authors and our community these days, the best of our works. And I'm excited to see this tradition continuing in the future. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks so much, Andrew, and all our readers. And I've put a link in the video chat again to the rest of the conference program. We hope you'll drop in later this week, and then the awards will be held Saturday evening. So thanks so much.